Testing, 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 testing. Good evening. Shall we start? Today, the first section of the lecture is on the continuation of the social landscape of the city. So we will discuss about stratification, justice, and also segregation. Whereas the second half of this section, we will have a paper discussion. Yesterday for the rush, I sent you something in the announcement because the paper is a little bit long, and also because it's a little bit difficult. So in order to enhance the efficiency, I have set up 5 questions, and then I've made an assignment to each one of you to concentrate just on one question that you need to have a presentation in the second half of this section on the paper discussion. So I hope that it would not be too rushed for you, because I presume that all of you should have read the paper. But when we divided up the sections, perhaps you need more time to reread the section and then do some summary. I think it's more efficient than make ourselves more concentrated on that. Hope we can have a good discussion this time. But if not, I mean, there's always room for us to improve in the next 2 discussion sections. So let us start on discussing stratification and justice. I have to unmute myself. Let me repeat a little bit on the discussion. I'm not sure when I was unmuted accidentally. In the second half of this section, we will have a paper discussion. So we'll expect all of you should have read the paper, and all of you should participate in the discussion. So in order to enhance efficiency, I'll tell you later at the end of this lecture section how we will do on the paper discussion. But the announcement I've made yesterday have assigned a question to every one of you. So altogether with 5 questions. So perhaps all of you have reread that part of the paper that is related to your question that have been assigned to you. So hope that we can have a more concentrated sort of discussion, because we only have about 80 minutes. So it's a little bit rushed, in fact, to have a discussion of a big group. So in the second half of this section, we'll divide you up into small groups so that you can do the discussion within the small group. I'll tell you later what to do. So the lecture today is a continuation of the social landscape of the city. So we talk about stratification and justice. So it's about how the groups or social groups in the city is being divided and the connection relation to each other. This is a very important concern, in fact, in the very earliest academic study of the city, because from the very beginning of the modern city, so remember in the second lecture, we mentioned about the rise of modern city, first in Europe and then in North America. And in some of those European or North American city, they turned into a big city, what we call the metropolitans. So they have hundreds of thousands or even millions of people concentrated in a relatively small area, which they have, I mean, most of the daily interaction are with strangers. And this is a process, what we call urbanization, forming cities and move population from the rural area to the city. And together with urbanization, in fact, is the increase in the degree of diversity. People in the city, they came from everywhere, either from various parts of the country, or in some European, North American countries like the United States and Canada. In fact, most of the populations, they came from different countries with very different culture, with very different language. And together with that is the social institution and organization of the city becoming more complicated. So the complexity of social interaction have added to a new so-called phase of the city. Particularly in the cities, we have emergence of sort of new social organization to cope with the urbanization, diversity, and also complexity of interaction. And in fact, this new organization and the diversities has been the concern in the late 19th and 20th, early 20th century, particularly in the United States, because of the inequality it created. And in the United States, there's a social, economic, and cultural background because of the slave industry. And when the slave was being so-called liberalized in the mid-19th century, many of those colored people, they moved from the South, where they have been, their ancestor has been slaves for generations. They begin to move to the North in the industrial area. But what happened to those sort of colored people, basically the black people, or now we call it the African Americans, they concentrated in areas which have a very high proportion of poor people. So with this concern, in fact, it triggers a lot of concern on those living conditions, on the relation between a community of people of different color, and also the so-called the conflict within and also between community. So in this lecture, we will start with a contrast on our understanding of the new division of social group, which is not the same as another tradition in Europe, which has quite a long sort of history, what we call the class analysis of society. But in the United States, they understood such division not in the term of class, but in another form of division, what we call stratification. And in fact, this way of stratifying the population has a far more profound impact on our understanding of social organization or social grouping than class nowadays. But a negative impact of stratification is something what we call segregation, particularly segregation of the ethnic groups. And when the problem of the segregation of ethnic groups being sort of lessens and become less apparent, then the segregation, residential segregation of income group has become more apparent. And it carry on through so-called societies of today. So now in many countries, ethnic segregation is no longer a very big issue, but the segregation of the poor and the rich has been a sort of very sort of serious concern in many of the society. And before we end this lecture, we will try to introduce what the critical sort of perspective, which I introduced also in the first lecture, how to look at those segregation and the consequences of segregation by discussion what we call the right to the city. And when we move on there, I will explain more about sort of the insights they have produced. So a traditional understanding about division of the class is via the writing of Karl Marx. So it's the class. So in the 19th century, Karl Marx has embarked on the theories about class society and the division of people along two big groups. One we call the proletarians, the working class, and the other is what we call the bourgeoisie, the middle class or the capitalist class. And for Marx, the division and also the conflict between these two groups, in fact, are expressed in a form of what he called the class struggle. So in fact, evolution of the societies have all the way been powered by class struggle. So that is the basis of social change. So, but increasingly, when we enter into the 20th century, the simple division of these two classes seems to be a little bit too simplistic and unable to describe what happened in the United States, for instance, in cities like New York, Chicago, or Philadelphia. Of course, I mean, there are also class, working class, and also the so-called capitalist class. But it doesn't seem that the two groups are first very distinct, and the other is they engage in continuous struggle with each other. But on the other hand, they witness another kind of division, which will make the simple dichotomy of a class seem to be too so-called simplistic. Because if you look at the division of social group in a little bit more details, perhaps there are not just about what class you belong to, whether you're a capitalist or you're a working class, that you are being exploited by the capitalists. Because when the cities become more sophisticated, more diverse, there are groups that cannot simply be classified as proletariat or bourgeoisie. There are somebody in between. Those now we understand now is the middle class, or even within the working class, there are differentiation within the working class. Unlike in the 19th century, most of the working class, they are at the bottom of the society. And most of those who are workers in factories, they work in similar poor condition with very low wage, very low living condition. But when the industry becomes more sophisticated and it becomes more technical, there are some workers within that working class who have a very different wage structure, very different status, with the so-called very so-called preliminary so-called worker at the bottom of the spectrum. So it seems that using a continuum to differentiate social groups appear to be a more meaningful grouping or more powerful in explaining the division of social groups and also the interaction within and between the groups. So there are some sort of new dimension of dividing up the social group, not just a simple relation to the what in the Marxist theory to the means of production, whether you possess the means of production of the capitalist or you don't possess that means of production and you work for the capitalist. So with wealth, with power, with status, you have a variety of division along a continuum with your position in the continuum of this three dimension of what we call socio-economic group, for short SES. And this, in fact, this conception was still used today. Class is no longer that popular today, whereas SES is a more neutral and less value-laden conceptualization of social group, and then it's still extensively used today to represent your position in a wealth status, in a wealth, in the social status, and also in power. There are many attempts. I just mentioned some earliest attempt because just two groups of workers and capitalists is too simplistic, but still people can be divided up along a spectrum. What we call people belong to the upper class. So they may be the capitalists, they are the wealthy people, or they are the lower upper class. They are also capitalists, but they may be owner, proprietor of sort of small business, but they're still so capitalists. So they possess the means of production. Whereas you may have somebody who are in the what now we call it middle class, but some in the middle class, perhaps they occupy some senior administrative managerial position in the industry or in any corporation. Whereas you may have the lower middle group, which occupy perhaps some kind of supervisory and management post. They are not the frontline workers, but neither are them so high in the hierarchy in the organization. And whereas even if the worker, we may divide up the worker into two different sort of status. Those who are skilled worker with higher wages as compared to people, what they call in the lower spectrum, which they have unskilled or semi-skilled being an elementary so-called worker. So later on, this simple sort of description had evolved quite a lot. So nowadays, what modern socioeconomic status will encompass is more or less on occupationally based classification. For instance, in different countries, they have a sort of different naming terminology on that. I take the example of a UK national statistics. So in census or in many of the national statistics, they will present group of people in terms of their occupation. So perhaps they belong to a sort of higher status, high wage, because they are high managerial, administrative, or professional occupation. So they may be closer to the what we call in the previous slide, the upper middle class. Whereas you may have the lower managerial, administrative, and professional occupation. Perhaps they are the sort of frontline managers, or they are professional with lower status. Take for example, usually we will classify, for instance, doctor and lawyer as in a higher status professional occupation. Whereas if you are a teacher, if you're a nurse, and you may be in a slightly lower professional occupation. Or you are in some sort of intermediate so-called occupation. Or you are a small employer, or you are a self-employed worker. So although they have possession of the means of production, but because of the size of the industry, the scale of the industry, they are in fact not that rich. But neither are they so-called workers and working for others. And you have also the lowest supervisory or the technical occupations, being skilled worker, or they are the frontline supervisor, responsible to administer a few so-called frontline workers, or they are semi-routine occupation. So semi-routine occupation would not command high wage, and entrance to the occupation is not that difficult. So perhaps they also enjoy less prestigious status. Of course, at the bottom of that is what we call the routine occupations. So those who work as a security guard, those who work as a cleaner, they need very minimal skills. And in terms of wage, in terms of the occupation, they're also not high. So these are the occupations that connect to their the classification that connect to the occupation. But of course, there are also increasingly people who have never worked or has been in long time unemployment, particularly in the European context after the 1970s, when there's decline in industry and mass unemployment and mass redundancy of the more traditional industry. And because of this, the provision of state welfare is not bad. So in fact, a lot of them, they either have never worked, but all their life rely on unemployment benefit or other kind of benefit, or those who lost work but was unable to find work, so they are also in long-term unemployment. So that will become a very distinct, but in reality, not too rare group in the social status. And with this in mind, I mean, this socio-economic status, they are more or less more neutral. They're more neutral because that reflects the reality that people in the society, they may have different wealth, they may earn a different wage, and they may have a different social status. And of course, I mean, this will also reflect some kind of power, although power cannot be so-called measured so directly. But what we mention, what we concern about is not just so-called on paper classification of people, but the connection of those classification in reality. Because in reality, that is not just a concept of grouping people into different social group, but that maybe have some kind of implication to represent people in different status, in different position in the society. So some are higher and they may have more wealth, and together with that, more power. So that is what we call stratification. Stratification have slightly sort of negative connotation. So it may not be bad, it may not be too good, because you stratify people into different layers and you assign some kind of value to that layer, whether they are more prestigious, they are more powerful. But what concerned the earliest scholar when they study city or study the city from a social perspective, whether those process of stratification which they observe in daily life, what makes that stratification? So that is the earlier concern. And there may be two lines of thinking on that. One line will think that this is natural. This is natural. Later on, when we introduce the Chicago school will think that that's natural. But in fact, there is another tradition which can be traced back to the Marxist analysis or Marxist school from Europe or from the European philosophy, which will see those stratification as something unjust. So although the pure Marxist analysis cannot directly be applied to such case, but the underlying philosophy or principle of this analysis may still apply. Why people are stratified and people are not equal? Because they are under unjust institutional setup. So although a simple dichotomy of bourgeoisie and proletarian may not be strong enough to explain social change, social development, but the underlying institution that is set up by the capitalist class may have a far more negative impact on the division in the society. So for these two camps of scholars, they may have a different view on whether social status is a problem or not. Some would say that social status is not a problem because it's natural, and perhaps it is also functional to the stability of the society. But the other camps may not think in this way. With the Marxist tradition, they will think that social status is a problem if it is differentiated, because it would so-called have an impact on the equality of people. So later on is this so-called line of thinking which can trace its lineage from the so-called Marxist school is what we call the critical perspective or critical school, which they would see is the status quo is establishment of the society that impose unjust institutions to so-called continue this unjust stratification or division of social groups. So it can be problematic. And a particular apparent phenomenon we can observe which have a direct connection to that stratification is something what we call poverty. So poverty have a long-term concern from the very start of so-called modern society, because it may be a concern from a purely humanitarian perspective, because people would not, we cannot bear or cannot endure other people's suffering. But the other may come from a social perspective, which they will see it as dangerous if you have the majority of people being poor, because they may one day rise up and revolt. And this is exactly what Marx has, Marx sort of theories and Marx analysis has anticipated. So that may not be good to the society. Even you think that is natural, or we should have some way to prevent the majority of people being poor. So the first line of thinking about that stratification is natural, is a theory, what we call urban ecology or social ecology, which have borrowed heavily from biology on Darwinism, because we all know that Charles Darwin advocated a theory that the evolution of species is driven by competition. So now what we see, those species that exist, and in this sort of particular form, is a result of competition and the principle of the survival of the fittest. So the earlier sociology, some earlier sociology was saying that perhaps this kind of principle and law, quote unquote, may also apply to the society. So that is what we call the human or urban ecology of the Chicago School. So the scholar in the University of Chicago, the first sociology department in the United States, who proposed this line of analysis in the 20s and in the 30s of the 20th century. So in fact, for them, human beings in cities, they compete with each other. But what they compete, unlike in the natural environment between natural species, they're not competing for food, but they compete for land. And because of the competition for land, there is a filtering process on housing and in connection to land use. In the spatial landscape of the cities, in a later lecture, we will explain this in a little bit more details, because it concerns about how land use and the spatial distribution. And if people have to compete in the new urban setting, so a very natural and in fact approach that makes sense is to rely on their preference, on their needs, and also on their incomes or income constraints to determine what they could get. Take, for example, housing. Take, for example, for a simple comparison, if you don't have money to buy a good house, buy a house that is not that perfect from your perspective. If houses in close to the city center is expensive, you have to move away. So I mean, this not now what we understand today, but this underlying this is also a variety or array of factors of need, taste, and income constraint. So that is something everybody is unique in terms of sort of this field sort of dimension. So that's your choice. That is your choice. So because of that, this the choice of people will settle in some kind of settlement within a specific area of the city. Although we call this as some kind of segregation, but for the social Darwinists, they would think that this is a result of natural selection. People with the same taste, same need, or same income constraint. So that's why those people who end up in places that will fit those groups. So because they have similar preference, they have similar constraints. So that is exactly a natural process, as is nothing special. And for them, in fact, clustering may be good. And in fact, this perspective of this view was not just shared by what we call the human or social urban ecologists, but also by somebody who have a so-called deep understanding of the operation of different social groups. Because for the Chicago schools, one branch of the Chicago school, they may just look at some kind of statistics, so-called large-scale surveys. But some member of the Chicago school, they also do some anthropological sort of study that will concentrate on a very few people, but to look at them, to observe them in great details and length of time. So in fact, for some of them, they would say that clustering may not be too bad. Although some people will think that if you have a division of poor people and rich people, people of different color that was spread in sort of different or concentrated in different area of the city, that will be extremely negative for integration. But for some of them, when they look at those groups who live together in a small area, they will say that the clustering may not be entirely bad, because clustering, like in our long history of civilization, people cluster together for defense. So perhaps in city, with physical safety is not a guarantee, so that people with the same color, people who are related by blood, or people who are of similar status, they stick together and they will help each other to defend against invaders. Or people stick together, they will have some kind of mutual help. So take, for example, new immigrants, when they go to a city which they know very little, so sticking them together may offer them help in a short distance, I mean physical distance. Or people with the same culture who stick together may have to reinforce and prefer their cultural conventions and habits. So we just mentioned that the Jewish community in the first lecture, Jewish community in New York may be a result of that. So they live for generations in the small areas, and they still practice the culture of the Jewish culture they brought from Europe. And clustering may also be good, like defense. They may have to resist any unjust imposition to them as a group. But this kind of positive dimension of segregation may not convince other people, because they will see that segregation, in fact, is not good. Particularly in the United States in the 19th and in the late 19th and early 20th century, when racial segregation is a big issue. So at that time, you have a very explicit segregation of people of color and also white people. They go to different schools, and some residential community would not accept people, or not accept color people. In restaurant, they may even have to go to different restaurant or to go to different toilets in the same restaurant. And that will have a lot of what we call discrimination. And discrimination may not be bad, may not be good, because the segregation, particularly about racial segregation, will reduce interaction. When you reduce interaction, you may make some ethnic or social group isolated. With this isolation, in fact, you have a very, very negative impact on assimilation, particularly for immigrants from other countries. Because it's, at least in the earlier part of the 20th century, people will still think that when there is a more unified culture and value and norm, or what we call the mainstream society, it may be good for the development of the cities and also good for integration and to develop cohesiveness of citizens. But the academics, they concern not just on the reality of the segregation, not just to measure the segregation, but to understand the cause of the segregation, particularly tracing what we call the structural causes of the segregation, how segregation is created by the social structure or the social institution. Of course, in the United States, the most important cause, structural cause of that segregation, ethnic segregation between the colored people and white people, is the slavery system. But even after slavery has been abolished, there has been a lot of that discriminatory thinking that will linger. One important, what we call implicit segregation practice that will create white only or black people only community is something what we call redlining. So there's a practice of the real estate agents and also the seller and buyers in some more upmarket middle class community, so that they will not entertain buyers which were not white people. But of course, that is not explicit, but implicit. So when you're a black people, if you want to move into a middle class community, which were basically white families, the real estate agents will be very enthusiastic. And the seller of the property, knowing that you are the colored people, they may charge you much higher of the bidding price than the competitor of the buyers of so-called white background. So that is also some kind of implicit practice in Hong Kong in renting as well, if you realize. So this, in fact, this practice, redlining practice, has persisted for quite a long time, for decades, even after ethnic segregation has been outlawed in the 60s in the United States. So that may also be some kind of resemblance in other cities. Take, for example, in Hong Kong, some ethnic minority in terms of renting, they may also be discriminating against. And in many countries, particularly in United States and some Asian countries, people living in public housing are being regarded as so-called more inferior. Of course, Hong Kong may not to such a degree. And I won't go into the details about this, what we call this similarity index. But this index has been created as a measurement to reflect what we call a segregation of social groups within a city. So the higher the number, the more segregated the city is. So it ranges from 0 to 100. 100 means that it is complete segregation, where 0 is a complete mix. So in the United States, even in the a few years ago, United States elected its first black president, but the ethnic segregation in the United States haven't been improved a lot. In the 60s, we have a discriminated index representing segregation of the color and white people at 86.2%. One simple interpretation of the index is in the 60s, if you need to equalize the distribution of white people and colored people in the city among all the small districts, you need to move 86% of the black people in order to achieve that. Of course, it can also be moving 86% of the white people. So a lot of those black people and white people, they are not mixed in a small area. They are quite segregated. So there are many districts that have a very high majority of white people, whereas in the other district, there was a very high percentage of black people. So that's why you need to move a lot of those people in order to get mixed. So that's what in the 60s, sort of a little bit expected, because the 60s was just the beginning of the change in ethnic discriminative law. But in fact, about 10 years ago, so it's about 50 years after the 60s, that index is still close to 60. So it has been improved, but not improved a lot. So white people and colored people in the United States is still very segregated, very segregated. But underlying this figure of 59%, there may be some subtle change simply because of the increase in diversity of ethnicity in the United States, especially the very rapid rising of United States citizens which have an Asian connection. So in fact, colored people, basically black people, they have been less segregated in the 2010 than in the 1960s. But the Asian ethnic minorities, their segregation have been increased. So that is something that is quite special in the United States nowadays. Whereas in Europe, segregation has all the time not be that serious. They are less serious. Although in countries like the United States, some ethnic minority are still quite segregated, particularly people from the South Asian like Bangladeshi and Pakistani. Whereas in Europe, in general, there's no dominating group. And Europe has less segregation because of the comparatively more abundant supply of public housing. And also the use of public transport will make segregation less serious. And that also applies to Hong Kong as well. So also in many of the European countries, they have very early have a very progressive integrative policy. So they welcome people from other countries as immigrants, very often as refugees, but they have deliberate policy with so-called state intervention and state subsidies to prevent those new immigrants from concentrated into the poorest area of the city. Of course, in many of the northern and western European countries, the sort of difference between different areas in a city is not as big as in city in the United States. So they may not have many rich people, but neither they don't have many poor people because of state intervention. Whereas in the United States, public housing is in short supply, so that many poor people, and they are overrepresented by colored people, black people. They are poor, and so there's no good public housing. So all of them are being accommodated in very low quality private rental housing. And because of the lack of public transport, when they cannot afford to rent in areas as close to their work, many of them simply get unemployed for a long time. So crime rate in those areas are very, very high. And the very, very poor public transport may make those situations even worse. In Asia, it's a little bit different. Similar to Europe, segregation in many Asian cities are not that apparent. Although not all of them are result of state intervention like the European cities, but there may be some cultural and economic reason for that, which I'll return later. When we go deeper into the spatial segregation, and I've just mentioned previously, nowadays in many cities in the world, ethnic segregation may not be the most apparent form of segregation. So that may still be very apparent in the United States, but not so in most of cities in the world. But the segregation of population along income group may still be very serious in many cities. Take, for example, this is a picture I get from the internet, which is a city in the Latin America, South America. So you can see that on the right side, there is a high-rise building, supposed to be a very luxurious, high upmarket so-called apartment building with very, very good so-called outlook and very big balcony and well-serviced with leisure facilities. Whereas on the left, just across the wall, they are all the squatters. Those squatters, they may even not have proper water or sewage system, and there is high crime rates in those squatter areas. So it's a very, very big contrast just across the wall. And in most such cases, in fact, those poor people, they suffer from what we call multiple deprivation. So that is the case in some highly segregated black community in the United States. They have high concentration of poor people, unemployed people, very high crime rate, very high infant fertility rate, very high divorce rates, or even very high so-called teenage pregnancies. I mean, all sorts of social problems concentrated in this small number of very poor community of poor Black people. And in fact, an extreme case of the existence of highly segregated community who suffer from multiple deprivation will cause a phenomenon, what we call an urban decay. So one very recent example of those urban decay is a city, perhaps you may have heard of that, Detroit. Detroit is the center of car making in the 70s, and even in the early 80s. But now it decays to a point that people are deserting the cities, and at the lowest point, in fact, if you have $1,000 US, you can even buy a whole street block, because nobody wants those housings, because they are so dilapidated, and some have been ruined, and there's some kind of rubble. So this is the extreme case. It happened because of what we call a downward spiral, depreciation of the value of the property, and with the value of property being depreciated, the rent decreased, and poor people who can only afford those so-called low rents, so-called apartment, they move in. When those people move in, it further exacerbates the image of the community being the community of the poor. And because of poor people, they may also have very low consumption power. With that low consumption power, some kind of sort of shopping facility or leisure facility, they are losing business, so they all move out. So in the context of the United States sort of cities, local government depends on local tax from consumption, and also from real estate, from land, to support public service. And if the land is valueless and people are poor, they cannot pay high tax, or even don't have to pay tax. The tax revenue, or the source of tax revenue, the tax base have been so-called losing, and so is public service. So when you have poor people concentration, poor public service, and it would usually also associated with high crime. High crime rate will make the image of those community even notorious. Just like what some of us understand the district of Harlem in New York City in the 60s and in the 70s. So this will eventually make rich people move out, or only left behind is the very poor people with no public services. So that's just like a so-called a ghost city, what we call it urban ghettos. So that is the what we call the downward spirals we had just mentioned. That vicious cycle will lead to a lack of maintenance, and lack of maintenance will increase the dilapidation, and then more people move in, local business losing their business, then they move out, and the district become even more rundown, and then eventually it will lead to a decay. So that is what happened in some cities in the United States, particularly the city along what we call the Rust Belt. So with the retreat of heavy industry along the middle and the southeast side of the United States. So I just mentioned about the similarity index in the in the United States cities. But another look at the similarity index in the United States. So another recent study look at a different selection of cities in the United States. So we will use some of the similarity index is not that so-called not that so-called poor in terms of not the ethnic so-called segregation of the ethnic minority, but the segregation of the rich and poor people. Because some colored people, they may be middle class. So even if they're segregated, they will mix with so-called their counterparts of colored people who is poorer. But if you look at the segregation of poor people and rich people, that's people on different incomes, the United States is not as bad as some European countries. Take, for example, an average of a certain number of United States cities will put the segregation of rich and poor to 36, whereas in Belgium is 35. So it's more or less the same. But some countries in Europe are sort of scoring particularly good. Take, for example, in the Netherlands, it is just 21%, whereas in Denmark it's 17%. And in this respect, it may indicate that the welfare state efforts in Europe may work to equalize the distribution of the rich and the poor. So the gap between the rich and poor in many European countries are not as wide as in the North American countries. In Asia, it's a little bit special. Take, for example, in the 90s, there is a study in Undst'g looking at the segregation of rich and poor people in their residence. And unlike Europe, in fact, what we call the welfare state effort in Japan still is, in fact, very low. So welfare in Japan is relatively poor. If you are unemployed in Japan, you may get very low income. And our image of Japanese being much better off than people in other Asian countries, because most of the welfare are being distributed by the enterprise. So it's the employers who support the high welfare of the employee, even after retirement. But if you do not have employment history, or you do not belong to a sort of wealthy big corporation, your welfare level may be a big gap from your friends and relatives who work in big enterprise. But surprisingly, with this low welfare state effort, spatial segregation in Japan is extremely low. And the authors, in fact, they offer an explanation that Japanese may not take residence as a symbol of status. So unlike people in the United States, when they perceive themselves as occupying high status in the society, they will try to stick together because the neighborhood they live in would also be a representation of their status. So the house they occupy is also what we call a status symbol or symbolic goods. So because of they put less emphasis on residence as a symbol of status, so that they are less cautious on choosing residential neighborhoods as an expression of the status. So you may, if you have the experience of traveling in big cities in Japan, if you go to the residential area, it's not that differentiable. What areas is area for the rich people, which are the area for the poor people? They look more or less the same. Of course, I mean, you may have some small area that look very shabby, but that's in a very, very minority. Whereas in the United States cities, that is so apparent. Just across the street block, the whole atmosphere, even the number of trees, even the cleanliness of the street, they are miles apart. Whereas in Japan, this is not that obvious. Also in Hong Kong, we also found that some contradictory result. Although if you measure the gap between rich people and poor people in Hong Kong, they are very big. So Hong Kong has a very big gap between the rich and the poor. Reflected by Gini coefficient, it was about 0.53 in 2016. But if you measure the segregation of concentration of rich people and poor people within the small area, surprisingly, you will find it not too high. It's just, I mean, it's very similar to some typical cities in Europe, the European cities. And you almost cannot observe any urban ghetto. Just what you see in the United States cities. And most of the neighborhood, they are mixed. So richer people and poorer people, they reach alongside each other in a small area. So there is some analysis I've done about 15 years ago that we can only identify some clustering effect of rich people who tend to live in a certain area. Whereas for the middle class and the poor people, they are relatively mixed with each other. So for those who are not familiar with Hong Kong, those what we call the Bay Area in the southern part of the Hong Kong Islands, they are area of the very rich. So are the Pok Fu Lam and also the Fair Park Views. Some of them, they have a high concentration of expatriates at the time when we did the research in tracing the data of 1996. But we cannot find a large concentration of poor people in a small district. We repeat the same study in 2006 with sort of newer census data. We even see that the similarity index of the poor have decreased. So as to say, poor people are now less likely to concentrate. But rich people, the similarity index has increased. So very rich people, in fact, they tend to stick to each other. We explain this with some kind of factors. Although we also see that one contributing factor is, in fact, the large-scale public housing. So if you see the figures between before the 1990s, in fact, there is a very good mix. The richest people and the poorer people, they all mix together in public housing. Although in recent years, that gap have been increased because of the government policy to encourage slightly richer people in the public housing to move out. And they accept more poor people into public housing. So the gap have increased. But even that have increased, people with middle income are still so-called very popular in public housing. So, but the other reason may mask the problem of segregation, because we have high density and also we have extremely high rises, and that may have deceived the measurement of segregation, which rely more or less on horizontal spread of population. So we discuss about segregation, but increasingly, people are more of the view that segregation may not be that good, because segregation will lead to unfavorable outcome like the urban ghetto or the urban decay we just mentioned. Even if it is not up to that degree, if we can have more mix of people of different income, it may encourage interaction, exchange, and enhance what we call social cohesion. So in fact, in some Western and Northern European countries, they have very deliberate what we call social mix policy. So deliberately putting poor people in middle class community so that they are able to mix with each other. Although this policy is also controversial because the artificial mix may not be generating genuine interaction. But what we concern is about that segregation will jeopardize, in fact, the right of poor people, of their choice of place of interaction. Because without that right, in fact, they may not be regarded as a full citizen. So rich people may enjoy full citizen rights. So everything that provided by the city can be enjoyed by rich people. But those similar services and rights may only be selectively available to poor people. So it's on such premises, some scholar would argue against the worsening situation of segregation. One thing to do that is to advocate the right to the city of poor and disadvantaged people so that they can claim back their right. So in fact, this is a perspective from what we call the critical school, or some of them, they are neo-Marxists. Some are not, but still, they have a negative view towards the establishment. So it is the current system that make barrier to the poor and disadvantaged group so that they cannot achieve their full right to the city. So in fact, the right to the city have been used as some kind of motto and some basis for less advantaged group to resist and claim back their right. So later on in some of the readings, you may come across this again. The right to the city is in fact consists of at least sort of 3 dimensions. One is the right to be physically present in the city. So the right of habitation. The other is the right of ownership and use of the city. We are not talking about the ownership of housing of this kind of private property, but public space. Because in many cities, and cities what we call neoliberal cities, which we will discuss in our next section, many of the public space, in fact, they are privatized. Even this is not completely private, but the setup, the rule of control may deter poor people from using. Or perhaps our festival walk is a very typical example. Festival walk, in fact, part of it is public space because that is the path you get from the MTR station either to the street level, the Cornwall Street, or to even the CDU. So you need to pass Festival Walk. So Festival Walk, some of the space inside Festival Walk have been assigned public space. But the way the management of the shopping mall managed, in fact, deter many poor people from staying in Festival Walk. So that you may say that people from the nearby public housing, you will seldom see them in Festival Walk, although they live so close, and perhaps their daily commuting would also involving walk through Festival Walk. But Festival Walk is not a place for them to stay. So that is some kind of very subtle control of them. The third right is about the right to participate. So in fact, even if you are poor, even you are powerless, you should be involved in decision making, particularly about the decision making on place, particularly public space. So the right of the cities, argued by the advocates of the right to the city, Don Mitchell, David Harvey, or Henry Lefebvre. Citizenship is the first generation of rights. So that has been granted to common people in the turn of the 20th century. So when you belong to a city, you are a citizen, then you have the full rights, particularly rights in election, universal suffrage. The second generation right is what we call the Socio-Economic Entitlement. So after the war, in many European countries, they begin to establish welfare. And welfare has become a right. Take, for example, you have the right to enjoy a minimum living standard. It's either being provided by a legislation in minimum wage, or it's by the provision of social security benefits. So this is the almost become a right of citizen. So when you're poor, you will not be left to death, because the government will intervene to top up your income to a minimum standard. So then the right to the community, to the people and group is being portrayed as the third generation right. So they should also be treated equally as the first generation right of citizenship, and also the second generation right of socio-economic entitlement. So this first generation right will give power to the less advantaged group to be included in decision making, or they have the legitimate base to struggle against exclusion. So if there are some kind of provision, services, and welfare to ordinary citizens, those are in this so-called lower spectrum of the society, the less disadvantaged group, the poor people's group, they have the right to voice their demand if they're being left out. And particularly, I've just mentioned about the physical presence in the public space. So this right to fight against denial and disenfranchisement of such right is being supported by so-called this so-called approach in the right to the city. So this is what I want to cover in this lecture as a continuation of the social aspect, or what we call the social landscape of the city, to look at the concern about social group at the turn of the 20th century, particularly in the United States, on ethnic segregation. And a modern representation of this division is something what we call the socio-economic group, which is a neutral sort of classification of people according to the position in their occupation. But later on, we shift more our emphasize on the negative side of segregation. Although some earlier study may reflect that segregation may sometimes be good, because in rare situation, you may have a sort of concentration of a particular social group, so that to allow them to preserve their culture, to allow them to set up defense, or to resist against the exploitations, or to offer mutual help. But increasingly, we realize the negative impact of segregation. Either it's the segregation of the ethnic minority groups or the segregation of people in different income spectra. So in this respect, United States have not improved a lot in the situation of ethnic segregation, although in terms of the income segregation, it may achieve so-called some accomplishment. But in general, European cities are better off in terms of keeping people together because of history and also because of their very specific state intervention on that. In Asia, segregation is not that serious. We have studied in Japan, we have studied in Hong Kong. Also, we have studied in Taiwan as well, which reflects segregation in Taiwan is also not that serious. There may be some specific reason because of organization of the city, where in Japanese cases, culture and the expression of the status may affect their choice of residence, and so that their status may not necessarily be reflected to where they live. In Hong Kong, it may be because of the public housing sector that will have some kind of de facto social mixed policy, or it's because of these physical scales that we may have segregation, but the segregation is so packed together, it's unable to differentiate. So we need more empirical study to take it out. So perhaps we can take a break. So come back again in 2030, so that we will have a discussion. But you need to go into another Zoom section I've set up. So I'll keep this section for another 5 minutes, so that if you have any question, you can type it in the chat box, so that I can revisit them when we come back. Or otherwise, see you in the another Zoom section at 2030. So I'll open that section 5 minutes earlier in 8:25. Okay, take a break and see you again.